Hello, the Airs for Architecture podcast's 191st episode is a conversation with Ellen Braae, Professor of Landscape Architecture at the University of Copenhagen, and Thordis Arrhenius, Professor of Architecture at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology, Sweden, about architecture and welfare, Scandinavian perspectives, the book they edited with Guttorm Ruud, and which came out with Berkhauser in 2025. To summarise, the book is complicated, composed as it is of 20 essays by different authors exploring aspects of post-war Scandinavian architecture and the role it played in materialising the welfare state and its ideals. Giving spatial form to principles of equality, collectivism and democracy, it was utopian in many ways, but also practical, central to a growth agenda, to use modern office parlance, that emphasised economic and social engagement, citizenship, in short. Today, as the political consensus around universal welfare struggles to find much support anywhere, architecture and welfare asks us to think again of that peculiar and in some ways dreamy architectural legacy, examining its contested past and uncertain future, and positioning it as a subject not just for historians and fans, but as a model that still challenges and instructs.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Airs for Architecture podcast. I'm talking today to Ellen Braae and Thordis Arrhenius. Thordis, Ellen, thank you so much for joining me. We're going to be talking about your very lovely book, very fascinating study, which you published with Berkhauser, Architecture and Welfare, Scandinavian Perspectives, which you edited together with Guttorm Ruud and published last year. As I said, it's a really interesting book. It does a lot of work, which I think is really productive and points, for me, towards a lot of contemporary issues and contemporary possibilities for housing architecture particularly. Before we get to talking about that a bit though, as all my guests do, would you be so kind as to introduce yourselves? Ellen?
I'm trained as an architect and a landscape architect, and then I moved into urban development and heritage studies. I am a professor at the University of Copenhagen since 2009.
And you're from Denmark?
I'm from Denmark, yes.
I see. And you trained and have practiced specifically in Denmark?
Yes.
And you got into development, so you crossed the Great Divide?
I don't know if it's the Great Divide. When talking about development is sort of more from a transformation perspective rather than sort of being in real estate business. So I guess that's sort of a Danish way of using the word development.
Okay, that still doesn't scan. I kind of want to understand what that means. So were you working with developers or were you working for municipal authorities? Was it at a more strategic level?
I'm working on urban transformation from both a sort of a scientific research perspective, but also advising on it, being during competitions and things like that.
To this point, have you seen major shifts in the way that has been engaged with, has been carried out?
Oh, huge differences. I mean, it's a long journey that we are sort of we are facing. I mean, coming from almost sort of greenfield development into transformation, first sort of on a more symbolic level, but now it's much more with a high attention towards materials, CO2 emission, circularity, and we also start to see questions of biodiversity entering that discussion. So, I mean, it's almost a 180 degree turnaround from sort of, expansion towards sort of redevelopment.
I think we'll come on to some of those ideas perhaps later on in the podcast, because I think they're really important reflections on how your study, how this book informs perhaps your thinking now, but also perhaps a wider discourse around urban regeneration in Scandinavia. And by default, I think, because of the broad publication and perception of Scandinavian social housing and welfare-orientated development, probably has a huge impact globally.
Yes, and the really interesting thing in this context is that we start to see post-war housing being sort of the object of transformation and further development under a bold headline called The Mixed City, which is sort of addressing these large social housing estates and projecting new owner forms, new typologies, basically new ways of living, and also turning what used to be sort of shared space into public space, which is something quite different. We may touch upon that later on.
Yeah, please do. Thordis, your turn.
Yes, my name is Thordis Arrhenius, as I said, and I'm a professor in architecture theory and method at the School of Architecture in Stockholm, KTH. And I'm also an architect, educated as an architect, and I have been mainly connected I have had run my own architecture office, but I also has been very connected into the academic most of my career, so to say. Maybe my main thing has been to be a teacher in architecture, and I'm running what we call a master studio, orientated towards restoration, reuse, repair, where we have worked very much with, and that's been my kind of focus, of what we call the welfare architecture or the modern heritage. And my interest is very much, and I come into this in some way from the discussion that Ellen also mentioned, how we take care of the huge material heritage from the welfare state. And what is the afterlife of that? So that has been my focus for the last 20 years, actually, I should say.
How do students engage with this particular thing? Because obviously, and I think we all track this in our conversation, the mindset perhaps, or the philosophy that underpinned that welfare state-driven urban change program has struggled, I guess, in the late 20th century, early 21st century, in the face of sort of neoliberalism and consumerism and many other isms.
Yes, for us it's been very much, I mean, it's been very interesting to have worked so long time within this field of reuse, for example, that has, the last 3-4 years has changed radically. I mean, in the beginning we had a studio, and you said you had some kind of few people who were interested in maybe restoration, that was a little bit worried that they didn't do their own projects, and the whole idea about, starting from scratch and producing kind of new architecture, responding to the times in some way, has totally transformed. And now we are in the after building and looking back to what we have in a very much other extent. And the students are really interested. So I have always a kind of too many people want to take the course, and it's become very popular in some way, because they also see, I mean, if you look at it more practical reasons, if you go out and work as an architect today, you mainly work with existing structures. So it's kind of new field that we're still kind of stumbling around a little bit with how actually to act as architects in that. And also how that affects education, of course, and things like that, how it and my main focus there is sort of to identify in some way the qualities of this architecture. The very, very strong, amazing quality. But also questions about how do you relate to something that is mass produced in terms of conservation, for example. There exists a lot of the same, so to say.
You use this phrase after building. Is that about sort of Charlotte Malter Barth's idea of we've got enough architecture and we now need to sort of focus more precisely on adaptive reuse?
I really agree with her positions. I mean, that's where we are now, in all sense. But also in terms of sustainability. I mean, the most sustainable thing you can do is to continue to use the building you have.
So I can understand perhaps where this book came from, but perhaps it would be nice to unpack a little bit. You can see the kind of general motivations. Was this off the back of a conference? What drove the kind of agenda for that, and how was it received?
So maybe you have to fill in, Ellen, a little bit, but it started actually with quite a long time ago that we created a network where we had several kind of people across the Nordic countries, across the Nordic architecture schools or universities relating to landscape architecture, urbanism, and architecture. And we saw a kind of shared interest of looking at this, what is welfare architecture today? Both how in some ways it should be brought forwards and also how we should take care of it. I mean, my position was that I was interested in to take care of what we have, but we had other in the groups looking also what could welfare architecture be today. And we connected between several different research projects, and in I think it's 2018 or 19 we applied for money for doing a kind of joint series of conferences that we did over a couple of years, and out of that is this specific book coming out of.
Okay.
So that was the background in some way.
Yeah, so there's both sort of a shared interest within sort of the academic environment across the Scandinavian countries to discuss what is welfare, how welfare has been materialized. It also taps into questions about sort of what architecture actually is when it's not creating something ex nihilo into the world, but sort of discussing something that is already there and thinking of its future. But it also taps into questions about creativity. What is creativity then when you are dealing with existing matter? Because I mean, in the beginning of both our careers, what at the time was labeled as restoration was considered as a straitjacket to creativity. But it was also sort of a journey of joint exploration. Somehow demonstrated the many differences between the countries and between different periods within the post-war era. So just saying that it was a multifaceted phenomenon. So that was what we could call sort of the align within, but also attention from the outside started to emerge. I mean, Bernie Sanders has been sort of pointing to Scandinavian architecture and welfare.
It was also interesting in a period when we kind of started. Also, this is a period in architecture, also from architecture history point of view, is very under-researched. So there was also, that kind of classical thing of actually mapping the buildings in terms of also, making a historical record of these buildings, because they were very under-researched and very, people haven't kind of considered them as architectural heritage, basically.
Well, at the time, the battle between how to consider them as either sort of heritage or as failed architecture, and that started to emerge.
But then on the other level, and then we had this ambition in some way or I was running a research project called Restoring the Welfare State, where we wanted to both look how the construction of the welfare state and also the reception and its afterlife. That was the three parts that I looked into in some way. And in that was also interesting at the time, we also started seeing very much the difference between the different, they were lumped together as the Scandinavian welfare state kind of model for architecture, but they were also very different. And that was very interesting in this kind of research network we had to see the differences in some way. And then we started this project was actually to look at both the shared kind of heritage and the differences in some way. And then it was also in the period when the Scandinavian model was appearing in a politically interesting way, but they were also lumped together. We have Sanders when he was running for presidency in the state, who kept referring to the Scandinavian model for architecture and welfare, or for not for architecture, but the Scandinavian model of welfare, and with the slightly kind of misunderstandings. But it was quite interesting to see how that pushed out at the time when we were standing in the Scandinavian context and seeing, we don't have that welfare state any longer. It was already, maybe in a pessimistic view, was dismantled. when America called for this as a model. So that was also very interesting to kind of see how the model in some way was projected from the outside, but also from us, from the inside, so to say, and challenging that kind of understanding.
It's very interesting, actually, that both sides of the political spectrum in many countries at the moment, it is argued that they're both calling for a kind of restitution of something that is a world of yesteryear, a time gone. Either the post-war socialistic welfare model or the post-war homogeneity and conservatism.
Yeah.
And neither of them are actually rooted in the present.
Yeah, but there's this time dimension to it as well, because of course we are somehow standing in the ruins of the post-war era. And some of it is in decay, and other parts have a bleak image, and other parts are working really well. But everything that would happen from now on should happen within that framework. And so the importance of deepening the knowledge about that sort of heritage or the ruins that we're living amidst is sort of key to move on in an informed and inspired way.
What was the nature of welfare at this time? And I ask this because the podcast's audience is very global. And so it would be kind of useful to understand the origins of this within the quote-unquote Scandinavian model, and perhaps with some references to the major differences. Where did it come from? Why did it emerge so strongly in these nations? And who produced it? What was the operational productive network that made it?
I mean, a lot of the thinking was there in between the two wars. It emerged in the beginning of the 20th century. We see workers' rights to have 2 weeks of paid holiday per year. We have this 8-8-8 scheme, 8 hours at work, 8 hours at sleep, and 8 hours of free time. We had rights even to children. And then the Second World War came and put everything on a halt. And after the Second World War, we entered a new industrialization phase, which was pretty much aided by American means, the Marshall Aid. That sort of fueled not just Scandinavia, but Europe, trying to enlarge Europe to become sort of the part of the inner market from an American perspective, but also creating some social structures that would avoid that. Politically, Europe would avoid being either communist or fascist, but try to create some kind of social stability. Many parts of Central Europe were facing bombing during the end of the war, but the Scandinavian countries didn't. So our rebuilding phase was slightly different than in other areas of Europe. There's a political scientist called Espen Andersen who has a definition of these welfare regimes, and he points to a triangle, the relationship between the state and the market and the citizens. So he defines some welfare state regimes according to how these sort of 3 parts are related to one another. And what characterizes the Scandinavian ones, called the social democratic regime, is that it's sort of the state that curbs the market in favor of the citizens. So that is somehow the basis. And then it was a true belief in planning, that we need to plan for a future in order to get to a better future, not just let things happen, which basically caused the First World War, but all those social differences and unemployment that we saw in the 30s that actually led to fascism, among other things. So there was a huge and profound belief in what planning could do.
We could say in the Scandinavia, also architects took a very, very close and strong role in that kind of planning perspective. And as you have pointed out, Ellen, this idea, the Swedish model is, of course, the close reliance between the market and the state. And you know, the capital is always part of the figure in some way. One could kind of maybe also state that from the beginning that in Scandinavia we have high taxes, or had previously high taxes, but we have always had the market has always existed and private ownership and so on. So there hasn't been a socialist country in that sense. We have never had kind of state builders, building companies and so on. So it's always been with the kind of model of negotiating in some way between the market and steering the market towards certain goals.
So this means that this welfare architecture isn't what we historically have called in Britain council housing. It wasn't built by local authorities. It was built by private development, managed and mediated by the state.
Yes and no.
Yes and no. That one has to kind of...
Maybe we should start by saying what are the dates we're talking about here? Are we talking
Yes.
1945 through to 1975 kind of thing?
Yeah, something like that.
So if stay with housing for a while, because in Malmö we could say we don't have social housing. We have rather public housing, but we have public housing and the idea about having housing as a service that is a non-profitable. It's not about profit. It's not making profit on housing. That's the kind of main thing. And it should be available in this universal idea that it should, the same type of house should be available to the whole society, to say. Now I'm using the wrong terms a bit.
Yeah, but I think we should also add that part of this social democratic welfare state regime is a close relationship between the individual and the state. So the whole idea that you should not be dependent on your social background, your family, whatever. You had a right to get an education. You had a right to get a place to live, and you could, to some degree, also say that you had a right to get a job. So there were these sort of 5 pillars that the whole welfare state was relying on. And well, in the book, we focus quite a lot on housing because that is perhaps the most interesting pillar and where the welfare values are most explicited. They're most sort of clearly projected. It's sort of closest to the individual. But we had public money going into a lot of things. So for instance, the housing was made by associations. They could have this state guaranteed loans, which would minimize the risk. They still had to pay back all the loans, but that meant that they could sort of build for all the money. They didn't have to reserve a large part for, inflation or whatever. And as Thordis said, it was non-profit. Today, I think it's 17% of the Danish population who lives in social housing. And at the beginning, it was considered to be for all social classes. Or seeding the market mechanism, sort of providing more housing than was needed, which was the case in Sweden, could also be a good example to highlight.
But now we're getting complex.
But don't mind a bit of complexity.
Yeah, to frame it trying to frame it more clearly in some way, it's that and it also looks different in the different Scandinavian countries, but in the Swedish context, one takes very strong decision to start the municipality to build, that the municipality should build and manage and take care of housing. And it should be provided because you also needed houses to create, wealth in the country as such. To create a kind of strong industrial country, you needed also to provide good housing. Also to have, it was never directed towards the poor. It was directed in some way to create good housing for everyone. And where housing also was seen as a right, as you say. So that's and then they put forward this kind of idea that the state didn't build, but the state provided rent, low rents, not rent, what do you call that?
No mortgage.
Yeah, no.
Or cheap loans.
Cheap loans, yeah, exactly. Rent-controlled loans. So the state were standing for the risk, while it could be municipality building or private people building and so on. But they also introduced the planning monopoly of the municipalities, and that's the crucial kind of thing. So the municipalities had planning monopoly. They decided how much or what should be built, and by whom, by themselves or by other private actors.
But it was not coordinated between the municipalities. They sort of decided on their own. But it was simply sort of as a pyramid or a upside down tree, that sort of a very fine-grained structure for dividing and providing welfare. And in terms of education, infrastructure, kindergartens, all these public institutions that went along with this development.
And was this across the political divide? Because I think one of the interesting things, that crisis of politics that we have in Britain at the moment, and I suspect in America as well, and other countries, is that nothing can get done because political positions have become horribly polarized, and every prime minister in England gets about 6 weeks, I think, before they get ousted. It must have been that there was a sense, a genuine political will from the demos itself for these things across the political spectrum. Is that a fair assumption?
I think that's a fair assumption, and I can speak mostly for the Danish part of it. It was run by Social Democrats. They had a huge sort of a mandate, but it was across the political divides. And you should also consider that the welfare goods were also distributed very widely. So everybody got a share. So the idea was to enlarge the cake and then sort of share it between the whole population. So for instance, education free for everyone. All parents would get sort of a financial aid to support raising their children. That kind of mechanisms where everybody would get a bit of the cake, even though they perhaps not even needed it. So it's a way of sort of spending sort of shared money, but spending it on everyone. So it's not just sort of a mercy for those who are at the lowest sort of social step of the ladder, but for everyone. And I think one of the places where we could really see this spelled out was in how the open spaces, access to recreational areas, have been distributed, and because green open space were considered the place where you could meet across cultural classes, across social classes, sort of on equal terms. If you were looking to other sort of cultural institutions, for instance, theater or the cinema, whatever, then it would be culturally coded in different ways. So a lot of efforts were spent on producing what we would call the welfare landscapes. They were made by means of public money, by the public for the public. Even though that you had all these sort of other institutions sort of taking part, like the social housing associations, municipalities, and other kind of associations. And I think the idea and the concept of associations where people on voluntary basis unite for this and that cause is also part of understanding this whole logic, because each of the Scandinavian countries are small, used to be poor. You used to have an experience of that if we want something to happen, then we need to unite. and make these things happen. So to a certain degree, this is also an institutionalization of such a collective experience.
It's very, very interesting.
We can also say quite often there is differences between Denmark and Sweden, and also Norway, of course, also in terms of geography and landscape and so on. Denmark was much more earlier urbanized than Sweden and Norway. In Sweden and Norway, we have this very strong idea about the right to nature, with what is called the Allemans right. You have the right to ramble and use and pick berries and things like that everywhere. So you have slightly different cultures in relation to that. But what you can see in the Swedish one is quite often the model is also called the Thordis model, in the same way that you provide industrialization, but you also provide a consumer of those industrial products by actually creating welfare. So it's not just about helping to survive. It's much more. It's like you create a kind of family who can afford. In the Swedish idea was that a family should have 1 to 2 cars, 2 to 3 kids, and have a good salary and work. And everyone should work also. That was very important. And you provide childcare, so you have like a household where 2 people can work and so on. So in a very, very short time span between the 50s and the early 70s, you succeeded to change the economic situation massively for a large group of people. Mm-hmm. That was super prosperous in some way or another.
I think that's a really interesting part. I think when we spoke before, Thordis, you talked about the kind of, I suppose, economic intention behind this welfare, housing and welfare architecture, that it wasn't simply a kind of paternalistic handing down of a gift, but rather it was an invitation to citizenship, an invitation to participate both as a social actor, but also as an economic actor in the flourishing of the broader society, broader culture.
But then there is also the strong, that I emphasize in my article, is also the strong idea, a very radical idea that comes actually starting in the 1930s, is to remove housing from the market. And to provide affordable, good, high quality housing towards everyone. Because that was the difference between the right and the left, and in some way that the problem in the market was that the market was too slow. It had to wait for they didn't start building until it was desperately needed and they could get paid well for it. And hereby, by taking it out of the market, is the idea that you just you build and provide as much housing, so you actually kill the market. And that actually resulted in the 1970s of an overproduction of housing. And then this kind of empty estates, and there was no need for that amount of housing. And that in some way started the crisis, and also the critique of this, that they were not kind of sought after, so to say. But that was also a kind of purpose idea. And also we have this kind of, who is still kind of very much discussed, this massive demolition of the inner cities and of older housing. And it's always been understood as some kind of idea that the modernist architect didn't like old houses and things like that. It had nothing to do with that. It had to do with the idea that you shouldn't have an alternative. So if you should provide housing so everyone have good housing, and it shouldn't be the alternative of staying in a bad old house with cool, facilities and things like that. They want to raise the kind of standard all over the spectrum. And that was, in one way, I could say, very utopian and strong idea. But that is the thing that really has transformed now. So already in the 80s, one kind of changed the kind of economic kind of things of of how the municipalities are run. They are run on business models now, and also what we call social housing or public housing is also run as a business model. So that has totally changed in some way. And when that changed, it's also become more expensive to live in a social housing than, for example, to own your own bungalow or like your own house. So that also means that the segregation starts in the 1970s very much. That people who stay in those kind of areas it's just the people who can't afford to buy or can't get, basically.
I do want us to talk a little about that challenge to both the realization but also the perception of social housing, and that the way that sort of indicates a shift in the social contract in many ways, the production and delivery of the social contract. We've gone from, in Britain, providing housing for a large section of society through council housing and social housing in that form, to sort of a deep resentment about that, of the undeserving poor, in a way, getting more than their fair share. I'm interested in how that plays out in your context. But you've talked about the nuances and the differences between the Scandinavian countries, and that's obviously a hugely important part of this book, I think, and probably subject for 10 podcasts in its own right. But loosely speaking, how was this embodied in architectural form? Were there significant differences between the way that this welfare architecture emerged in these countries, the forms that they took? And then I guess off the back of that, was there also sort of sharing and learning between Scandinavian countries of best practice? Or was it not as strategic as that?
We have one essay who points out that very specifically the situation during the war is, of course, that Sweden is still a neutral country, and they receive the whole group from Norway and from Denmark. Architects are refugees in Sweden, and planning their kind of, especially Norway, plan their whole kind of, when they should return in some way, planning out their new kind of strategies for urbanism and housing and everything in Sweden. And that was a huge exchange of ideas during that time, extremely strong. Also collaborations, we could say. Yeah.
And Sweden has a long history of large industrial companies. So the industrialization of housing also had sort of its epicenter in Sweden.
Yes. So, and we have kind of different phases. We could say we have that, the decision in some way that comes in the mid-50s to actually, that is established as the program that is nicknamed the Million Program. When it's decided one should build 1 million housing in 10 years. And this we have to understand is a population of under 8 million at the time. And that to land that kind of program was also a very strong idea about industrialized building. So totally in some way transformed, the building industry is totally transformed. And that also related to the way of getting loans for building. So you provided that you have to build at minimum 1,000 units if you should get these good state loans, state guaranteed loans. So it's in some way created a certain type of building and maybe sometimes not the highest quality of architecture, but sometimes also very experimental and trying out this new kind of industrialized architecture. And as a result, also creating these huge, large building companies. We have still them acting today, like Skanska, a global, are coming out of that period in some way.
But also on sort of the national scale, the three Scandinavian countries differ quite a lot, because in Sweden, the sort of all ambition was to centralize around few large cities, and this was where the housing was erected. Norway, they choose the opposite strategy. They want to subsidize all the small villages across this in geography very huge country. I mean, In Norway, they have a population about 5 million people, which is the same as Denmark. Denmark is just so much smaller. And in Denmark, we choose a sort of in-between strategy, working with sort of hierarchy of cities that would work in that pyramid of distributing welfare.
Obviously, the book is looking at architecture as I put in my notes to you, a medium for translating philosophical ideals like universal welfare and citizenship into built form. How was this realized in design, and what role did architects play? Because very interested in this idea that the state manages to kind of coordinate a broad range of actors, including manufacturers and innovators around the technologies of architecture. How are architects playing a role in that? And how did this philosophical understanding reveal itself in Scandinavian housing?
Well, thinking about how some of these large-scale housing estates, they were materialized, I think they're really interesting because, as we discussed previously, there was this sort of direct relationship between the individual citizen and the state, that there was this kind of security. But in between, there's this sort of a layer of communities, of associations, of all these sort of getting together in various ways. And if you start to look at the large-scale housing estates, you can simply decode a lot of this, what you could call, with Anderson's word, imagined communities. You could see how the shopping part is placed at the edge as a hinge between the social housing estate and the surrounding city. You can see how there are small spatial formations next to the entrances to the hallways on the sunny side for one hallway or several hallways, and how they sort of cluster and add up, and perhaps are even centered around a large open space, which again then is connected perhaps to the sports facilities in the nearby school, which again is connected to more remote recreational areas. I mean, the emblematic part of it is the Copenhagen finger plan, where the fingers are sort of the urbanized areas, and the areas in between the fingers are the green wedges that would ensure that you could have easy access to remote, large-scale green recreational areas. So there are these sort of linkages that install you as sort of as citizens in that kind of society. So it has sort of its moral implications, also in terms of what was envisioned that could actually happen in those shared spaces. Ideas about how you could dress and how you couldn't dress, and I mean, how you would enter your home. And there are a lot of sort of ethics involved with that. So it's not just a matter of providing welfare of various kinds, but it also has this sort of moral implications, I would say.
But we can say there is also a difference between Denmark and Sweden, who maybe opt, even if I should also remember that most of the what is called the Million Program was also acted out in kind of quite small scale buildings. So the huge estates are relatively few compared to the mass of, 2 to 3 stories block houses in some way. But it's also interesting you asked the role of the architect. And we could see in the Swedish context, the architects are very close to the political establishment, and they collaborated very near together in some way with the idea about how one should live and how this should be realized, also in terms of aesthetics. And then there was also clear a lot of research on how many cupboards do you need in a household, what is the best layout for a kitchen, and so on. It was very much kind of scientific approach to the laying out of the best plan and so on, who has also, of course, been quite ridiculed in some way. It was kind of manic in that kind of, but that together with how the buildings also formed on another level, formed neighborhoods and shared kind of facilities were also very, the plan on all levels in some way. The planning was discussed with architects and planners. And we can see we have that, what I call the kind of civic architect, that in some way was part of serving society rather than, doing a name for himself or being a star architect. So it's the idea of providing this as a shared kind of idea. And that was very strong in this period.
I also think it's important to pay attention to that, this concept of the welfare state and its materialization. It was not a fait accompli. I mean, it wasn't something that everybody knew from the very beginning what this could be or should be. It was a huge laboratory evolving over all these years. And as you say, Thordis, architects actually really took part in that conversation about what is actually welfare, because that was what they sort of built into the spatial structures.
Obviously, things have changed over the subsequent decades since the 70s, and since perhaps what might generously be called a loss of confidence in the idea of the welfare state, certainly here, and I assume in Scandinavia as well. And some of the essays in your book certainly engage with some of these critiques. Preeminent among them, amongst architecture interested people, is that the architecture itself was fundamentally alienating, that it wasn't embedded in embodying cultural norms or aesthetic expectations, or that it separated out communities or did various non-productive things that have led to negative social outcomes. But there's the other side of it, which is that in some places this welfare architecture didn't really consolidate or confirm the undergirding political philosophy behind it. I'm quite interested in that tension, that you end up getting attacks from both ends of the spectrum. One saying, look at this horrible socialistic Leningrad type architecture. And on the other end, you've got people saying it's not social enough. Did you encounter this tension much in the book and through the papers by your contributing authors? And what does it kind of suggest?
I think it's quite important that we look in some way at, we look at the critique that emerged in the late 70s and also 80s, when also the economic is changing at the same time. And architecture become there, it's the form of the architecture who should change rather than the economic running it behind. So that in some way create this kind of, I think a lot of the problems that are created at the time in some way. On the largest, I try to understand it also as we have a period when we have the big programs. We have the Million Program, for example, and then that is moved over in the 1980s with the neoliberalization into projects, and also the financing of the projects gets very different. So if you from the beginning have like a universal, you get the same situation if you build a house up in the north or in the south, or is the kind of national in some way. You're suddenly starting getting projects that are depending on the local situation, local initiatives, local kind of money coming in. You're bidding for money in competition. And then you have to formalize a problem in some way. And then these become problems. It's a lot of examples of the state I'm writing about, for example, where people were very happy living there. There was not a problem, but it was stated as a problem. It becomes a problem that also can generate money. Now I'm talking very critically, but it's that kind of moving to the local also had this other negative thing in some way. And it's also, of course, comes with the thing that people are, it's not economically valuable any longer to live in those areas. It's more expensive than, as I said before, as to create your own house or buy your own little bungalow somewhere. So in some way in the 1980s and onwards, the social housing estates are drained, and people are left there are either people who can't get a loan. And first it's the kind of pensioners, and it's the get young people, and then later becomes the immigrants that can't get a loan, basically. And that become in some way the estates. And then there comes the critique of the architecture with it.
I also think that we should see it in the context that there were so many experiments going on. One thing is the way that we build, but it's also the way that we live our lives. It's our children going to institutions. I mean, everything sort of changed over a few decades for almost everyone, and sort of finding one's feet in that is one thing. But when you start looking into the specific places, the specific estates, each of them has their own sort of history. How things come about, how it was built, who moved in, and what then happened. So rather than making a huge conclusion about how form and social aspects they relate to one another, which has been done politically, it's much more nuanced. We can find similar housing structures where one works excellent and another one has a lot of challenges. So, and I think that is also sort of the flip side of this huge expansion that took place within a very short time period, that we tend to replicate that gigantism that we saw at the time when we are readdressing them, rather than sort of staying with it and looking at it as sort of smaller parts and then understanding what kind of network that they are embedded within. I mean, sort of looking at them in their own right, rather than sort of making bold conclusions.
And that comes back to the idea of the historiographic encounter with it as well, doesn't it? Which is that, as you said, Thordis, at the beginning, this is a largely underwritten thing. How did this, dealing with the granular qualities of it, how did dealing with the particularities of these things challenge you as historians and demand a new historiography?
I think that specifically that thing of actually studying them is very important. So we have done this thing with the students, for example, that we draw them in a way that they haven't hardly been drawn before, and paying attention to them. And that has been amazing, also interesting to do, and also interesting when we have done exhibitions. We have showed, working with local people and looking at them, they get, it's fantastic. They really, you get this kind of contact with people saying that they really like it. So we did an exhibition in a library down in Norrköping, and then the librarians were calling up and saying, they say, do the architects really mean that they think they are beautiful? And we said, yeah. And they said, yes. So that's kind of, looking in some way, I think is very important. And then, of course, writing their kind of individual history, as you say. There are different, it was different builders, there were different kind of factories, there were different materialities, and so on. So I think that's also to give individual history back to something that they are seen as a kind of super repeated thing in some way.
Yeah, less a monolith, more a network, but perhaps less a monotone and more a quilt, more a beautiful array of different expressions around a kind of core idea, social democracy.
This kind of narrative of the grey concrete, and then you go and look, and they're not grey; they are painted or all the colors, and
That's very, very interesting. I wanted to finish on one last question. I've taken up enough of your time, but in compiling this book and in engaging with these places, what does it point to? And I know this is probably a terrible thing to ask historians, but you're theorists, so you can do this. You can have this question. Like, what does it point to? Like, what can we do with this? Where can we take this? Because this lovely relationship, this productive and confirming relationship between state, enterprise, or the market, and citizenship, and also the cultural institutions that really exist outside the state, produce this thing together. What do we learn from this, both in terms of its positives and its negatives, that we can take forward?
We learn to work with visions and missions, I think. discussing where we would like to go, how we would like things to evolve, how we should work together as a society, and how me and my neighbors should somehow work around with things. There's something about that openness towards a horizon in which you have a shared belief. You may not agree completely on how it should look like and how it should work, but you are in the process. And right now, I think we see a fragmentation where things are chopped up in bits and pieces and with very sort of local agendas being worked out for each of them, and some of it pretty market based. And I think we are in a situation with sort of this one planet where we really need to reconsider what we have and what we want to do with it. Where should it take us? What kind of resources do we have at hand? And how do we share those shared resources? And how do we further develop them in a way where we don't just keep eating bites of the apple, but also can have things flourish and think in a more regenerative way, and consider these resources materially, structurally, socially, geographically, that the post-war structures and that they have provided us with.
That's the kind of positive way of looking at it. In some way, I should say that what we have now is this kind of ruins, these structures. They stand there, and they are like in the kind of neoliberal system that we are in now, or in the asset economy we are now. They are now sold and bought and part of kind of global kind of finance. Within that, they are there still. And I think from the thing that can really is the kind of environmental crisis in some way. They're there and they need to be lived in. People need places to live in. So just take care of them. It's the only thing one can do in some way as an architect, to just go in and see, how do we take care of this without changing so much, maybe. So
I mean, that's the biggest task that we have as architects and landscape architects, etc. Right? That is to, how can we get to love these places?
Yeah.
So we can sort of share that caring.
It's a lovely, slightly melancholy, but also slightly uplifting, as melancholy often is, point to finish on. Thank you very much, Thordis. Thank you very much, Ellen. It's been a delight.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
This is the dream we carry through the world, that something fantastic will happen, that it has to happen, that time will open by itself, that doors shall open by themselves. That's from This is the Dream by Olav Haig. Thanks to Thordis and Ellen for the chat, and to Guttorm too. Thanks to them for the invite to the launch at the AA bookstore yesterday too. It was a joy to play a very minuscule part in it all. Please see the podcast description for links to the book and to Ellen and Thordis at work and on social media. And thanks for listening.